Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Kris Mackowski, and joining me is Emerging Civil War co-founder Kris White. Good morning, Kris.
Good morning to you.
And it is the 160th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So we wanted to take just a few moments and acknowledge the anniversary of history today. And Kris, aside from being something that's hard for a lot of people to spell, what's significant about the Emancipation Proclamation in your mind?
Well, I think the Emancipation Proclamation is significant because it's really got new legs within the last 20 to 30 years of history. It's issued on January 1st, 1863. The preliminary comes out on September 22nd, 1862, in the wake of Antietam. And it really is going to truly put on paper, pen to paper, that this war will be about the ending of slavery. This will be one of the first major steps to changing the war aims of the North. I mean, overall, the Civil War is about slavery, but it's kind of that unspoken thing for a while within the Lincoln administration when the war begins. It's more about putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. Maybe going back to status quo antebellum and figuring out a way to not deal with this issue of chattel slavery in the United States without going through a prolonged war. Well, as the war drags on and things pop up like, Ben Butler making slaves contraband, as he calls them, and David Hunter in the Deep South going and freeing slaves without any sort of backing of Congress, the Senate, or even the president. Lincoln more and more gets forced into a corner to bring this issue to the fore. So in the wake of Antietam, one of the federal victories in the Eastern Theater, you could call it a stalemate, really, Lincoln is going to issue this Emancipation Proclamation September 22nd, kind of setting the stage for the midterm elections. It'll come up in November, and then state on January 1st, 1863, that he's going to sign this into law, which will allow blacks to serve in the United States Army as well as the Navy, and it's going to free slaves in the areas that are still in rebellion, which is a key item because he's trying to appease the border states of places like Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, who still have slavery. He doesn't want to take away slavery there and upset that balance of manpower as well as geographic positioning whenever you look at Washington, D.C. sitting in Maryland. So whenever you start to look at all these items, you now have you have Lincoln trying to change the course of the ship, if you were, or turn the ship towards this kind of political end as well as a social shift. And I think over the last 20 to 30 years, we've started to see scholars take this more seriously. And that's what we call the new military history. The new military history actually takes into consideration everything, not just the mud and blood. It takes in the politics, the economics, everything. And so I think the emancipation, especially around the turn of the 2000s, really saw a big uptick in history and people really appreciating what it is and what it does for the war.
You had mentioned earlier efforts by Benjamin Butler and David Hunter to sort of force Lincoln's hand on this. And it sort of implies that there's a lot of support within the military for this sort of shift. But once Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, it's not universally admired, particularly in the Army of the Potomac, which is sitting right outside of D.C. What are the implications of that?
Well, you have to remember the armies are very political beasts, and at the time the Republicans are in charge. The Republicans of the 1860s are the Democrats of today. When you start to look at the Democrats of the 1860s, they're the Republicans of today, and much of the army is a Democratic based. It is going to be, George McClellan, George Meade. These men are all Democrats. And when they go off to war, they're not necessarily abolitionists. So now with you changing the nature of the war, you're turning the United States Army into a machine of abolition. Wherever the Union Army goes, freedom will then follow, especially going through the Deep South. Now, that's not to say that this wasn't the case. in 1861 or 62, whenever the Army goes onto the peninsula, or Fort Monroe is sitting down at that tip of the peninsula, and Ben Butler has that run-in with what he calls contrabands. We have these freedom seekers, as we call them today. That is not a historical term. These freedom seekers who come out and they self-emancipate themselves. They come into Union lines, and we have great evidence of this. I mean, through diaries, but more specifically through photographs. You take a look at many of the Union officers who take pictures in 1861, 62, 63, and they will have black servants with them. And these are usually newly emancipated slaves who come into the lines and need a job. So they'll work with them. So, you know, the emancipation is something that now it's on paper. Yeah, it's official, but it's something that had been in practice for the last year and a half or so of the war. Fredericksburg, Virginia is a perfect example. It's the front line of war, the front line of emancipation. As many as 10,000 people freed themselves down in the Spotsylvania area, Stafford County area, when the Army showed up in April of 1862. So from April to August, there's this great exodus of humanity who were trying to get their freedom into the Union lines. So, you know, back to your question, we have this army now who's not very happy about being turned into this political entity, and they're now the sword of Lincoln that is now what is going to be at the spear point to, you know, free these people. But war is politics. Karl von Clausewitz, you know, says it very eloquently in his treatise on war. So, you know, it's not up to the army to set the political agenda. The political agenda is set within any military up to this day is set by our enduring values and beliefs. It's set by our politicians, and it's set by our founding documents. It is up to the Army to follow those orders that are set forth by these items, and then, you know, to do the will of the people. You'll have blustering from Joe Hooker and George McClellan and others talking about, you know, dictatorships being set up and this, that, and the other thing during the war. But in the end of the day, the Army works for the politicians, and the politicians work for the people. So what Lincoln is doing is pushing forward the agenda of what he thinks will be the betterment, what will help the betterment of this country.
I think that was always one of George McClellan's great weaknesses as a commander. Is he didn't understand that notion that war is politics, and seemed to have a very deaf ear. And maybe I think that's one reason why Robert E. Lee was so successful in a lot of ways, why Ulysses S. Grant, they understood that political military connection, I think, a lot more intuitively than McClellan seemed to get it. So Lincoln needs his sword to do something in order to score some battlefield victories, to really give the Emancipation Proclamation some teeth. But November and December don't really pan out very well for him on the battlefield to give him a strong hand to issue the final emancipation on January 1st. What does that stretch look like militarily?
Well, I always say I describe the Emancipation Proclamation in oversimplified terms. It's like the U.S. government trying to implement a speed limit in Canada. You know, the Canadians are like, that ain't going to happen, eh? And, you know, that's what you're seeing here in the South. So, you know, the emancipation takes effect in places that are still in rebellion. So if you look at that definition, so Richmond, Virginia is still in rebellion in 1862. It's capital of the Confederacy. And now we need the Army to go down there to take away the rebellion, and put down this rebellion. And this will be the way for them to help free the slaves. So in theory, all the slaves are freed in Richmond on January 1st, 1863. Now the Confederates have a whole different thought of that. They've put together their own, you know, government. They have their own president, vice president, Senate, all this stuff. And they're like, nah, you can't implement a law in our land. Lincoln looks at it very differently. You know, he doesn't see the legitimacy of the Southern Confederacy. So, you know, this is where you get into the constitutionality of secession and some other things. But then you look over in New Orleans. New Orleans is no longer in rebellion. New Orleans fell in April of 1862 to Federals, and they're having a wartime reconstruction going on down in New Orleans. Even the State Department's issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in small booklets to the people of New Orleans to explain exactly what it is. And then on the back side of it, they're actually putting one of the speeches that Andrew Jackson had given during the Battle of New Orleans to kind of show that New Orleans was part of the United States at one point. We're here to protect you, all these different things. So by November and December of 1862, the Southern Confederacy is starting to crumble. They don't believe in this whole, emancipation thing. Many of them are outraged. In the North, you have some deserters, like there's a member of the 5th New York Cavalry who will go over to Mosby's Raiders. They call him Big Yankee. And he famously becomes a Mosby Raider. And in the South, you have these Southern politicians as well as soldiers and others upset, because not only are you trying to implement something within our country, you're now trying to foment servile insurrection is how some of them look at it, that they're trying to have a slave uprising, kind of like John Brown during his domestic terrorism event at Harper's Ferry, as we call it today, or his raid, or whatever you want to call it, depending on what side you look at it. And Lincoln has all this that he's weighing. So what do? You send your armies into the South to really try to win victories. To make a very long story short, which I'm not doing a great job of right now, Ulysses S. Grant makes his way down towards Vicksburg. He comes to woe at a place called Chickasaw Bayou. Specifically, that's William T. Sherman. Nathan Bedford Forrest and Earl Van Dorn will cut Grant's supply lines as he moves south. That doesn't go well. In December 1862, Ambrose Burnside, the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln's principal army, he moves towards Fredericksburg. He comes to woe on the banks of the Rappahannock. And then there's the battle at Stones River or Murfreesboro that takes place from December into January of 62 to 63. And even though Williams Rosecrans is victorious, his army is so battered that it can't do battle for the next 6 months. Regardless, Lincoln has to put his money where his mouth is, and he has to sign the Emancipation on January 1st of 63. Otherwise, he's going to look like he's backtracking. That would be bad politically on many fronts. So even though things aren't looking very good in this winter of 62, 63 on the military front, Lincoln has to push forward. But at the same time, Lincoln is not as concerned on the military front as some people, I think, make him out to be today. He gets upset early in 1862 and mid-1862 and says something to, I think, the French consulate along the lines of, look at, we might be losing here in the East, but look at all these great victories we had out in the West to places like Shiloh, Corinth, Island Number 10, New Orleans, all these places. The Southern Confederacy is failing. It's falling apart inwards. It can't play well with itself. Union armies are starting to come in from all sides. They still have a few more months of things going well for them, at least on paper, or in the papers, but it's starting to fall apart. And the Emancipation Proclamation is just another way of Lincoln to knock out one of those foundation stones of the Confederacy. And of course, that's chattel slavery.
Now, if this was National Public Radio on the 4th of July, we would read the Declaration of Independence, or if it was Remembrance Day in Gettysburg, would read the Gettysburg Address. The Emancipation Proclamation is not a piece of eloquent prose meant to be read aloud and stir the souls of the listeners who are there. What is it about the document itself that stands out to you?
I think that it's more the political statement than the actual words itself. This is Lincoln, really going out on a limb. He announced this thing prior to the midterm elections, and historically speaking, in the U.S., the sitting party at that time, who has the power in the U.S., doesn't do well during the midterm elections, because everybody likes that backup quarterback. They're always the favorite quarterback in any city, and they always look at that on the political side. The Democrats are terrible right now. Well, the Republicans are terrible right now. That's historically accurate if you look back through our history. But whenever we look at Lincoln and his emancipation, I mean, he could have backed down. He could have taken a different course, but he stays that course. He put his money where his mouth was, and he knows that this isn't going to be that popular especially in the South and even parts of the North. So to go out there, he kind of goes out on a limb. And this is not the first step, but this is, I would say, one of the big first steps towards the ultimate freedom of African Americans in the U.S. So this is very important once we get into the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments at the end of the war. Those do a lot more than the Emancipation ever did, but symbolically speaking, this is throwing down the gauntlet to the Southern Confederacy as well as the North, and as well as the rest of the world. Lincoln needs to show France, Great Britain, Mexico, and others that, yeah, this might be an internal strife, but now it's a strife over the freedom of nearly 4 million people. And I don't ever think the French or the British were going to come into this war unless the U.S. government was on its last legs. I think that was all pie in the sky for the longest time. All you have to do is read a little bit of British history to understand how they operate. But but Lincoln nonetheless has to send this symbolic message, and down the road it pays dividends. It's not a perfect document, it's not perfectly implemented, and it's not as popular as some people might think today, but it is an important first step.
I think too that it's I've called it Lincoln's most perfect inelegant writing because it's a legal document. It's not poetic at all, but he has so many needles he has to thread between European intervention and the border states and abolitionists and non-abolitionists and North and South, and so this legalese allows him to navigate those spaces, I think, super effectively in a way that he doesn't have to worry about this. I think he would get bogged down if he had to be rhetorically flourished and inspirational. He would eventually alienate some of those audiences he's trying to thread the needle on.
Yeah, and I think that's important. He has to thread the needle, and this is more of a legal document than anything. So he has to put on Front Street exactly what this thing is going to do. This can't be like some amendments to our Constitution that are out there, and it's kind of like, what did they actually mean by that? He's going to put it on paper, and he's going to, this is what it means. Is it a perfect legal document? Absolutely not. But again, it's a big first step, as I call it. Is it the first step in the ending of slavery in the U.S.? Absolutely not. But in a way, it is a first step towards getting those Civil War amendments.
So 160 years ago, January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. We're going to post some links and resources on the blog and on our YouTube page to connect you with more about the Emancipation Proclamation, pretty significant turning point in the American Civil War. Kris White, thanks for joining me today to talk a little bit about the EP. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. I'm Kris Mackowski for Kris White. We will see you online and on the battlefield.